before the pyramids pierced the sky, before pharaohs were crowned gods on earth, before hieroglyphs carved stories into stone, there was a river. A single ribbon of water flowing through an unforgiving desert gave birth to one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. Along the banks of the Nile, humanity learned how to organize, believe, build, heal, calculate, record history, and rule empires. This is the early story of ancient Egypt, not a myth, not a mystery, but a real African civilization that shaped the foundations of human history. Ancient Egypt developed in northeast Africa, concentrated along the lower Nile River, where fertile soil met harsh desert boundaries. These natural borders protected Egypt from invasion while allowing internal unity to flourish. According to conventional chronology, ancient Egyptian civilization emerged around 3150 BCE, when Upper Egypt, the south, and Lower Egypt, the north, were unified under a single ruler. Tradition credits this achievement to Menes, though most modern Egyptologists associate him with King Narmer, whose legacy is preserved on ceremonial artifacts depicting unification. Egyptian history did not progress in a straight line. Instead, it unfolded in cycles. Long periods of stability and prosperity interrupted by eras of political fragmentation and hardship. Historians divide this long history into major phases. The Old Kingdom of the Early Bronze Age, the Middle Kingdom of the Middle Bronze Age, the New Kingdom of the Late Bronze Age. Between these periods came the intermediate periods, times of decentralization, drought, and internal conflict. Egypt reached the height of its power during the New Kingdom, when its armies controlled Nubia to the south and exerted influence deep into the Levant. But like all empires, Egypt eventually declined, facing invasions by the Hyksos, Kushites, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and finally, the Romans. Some historians mark the end of ancient Egypt with Alexander the Great's conquest in 332 BCE, while others point to 30 BCE, when Rome absorbed Egypt after the fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Centuries later, the Arab conquest of 642 CE ended the Greco-Roman chapter of Egyptian history. No river in human history has shaped civilization like the Nile. Each year, predictable floods deposited rich black silt along its banks, renewing the land and allowing consistent agricultural production. This reliability gave Egypt something rare in the ancient world: food security. With surplus grain came population growth. With population growth came specialization. Farmers, builders, priests, scribes, artisans, soldiers, and administrators. Controlled irrigation systems transformed the Nile Valley into an agricultural engine. The state coordinated planting schedules, water distribution, and storage, ensuring survival even in difficult years. This economic stability supported monumental architecture, long-distance trade, organized religion, and a centralized government under divine kingship. At the center of this system stood the pharaoh, believed to be both ruler and god, responsible for maintaining ma'at, cosmic balance, order, and justice. Long before pyramids and crowns, Egypt was green. During the pre-dynastic period, the climate was far less arid than today. Much of Egypt consisted of savanna grasslands, supporting giraffes, ostriches, antelope, cattle, and large herds of wildlife. Rock art found in desert regions like 𝒃𝒓𝒂𝒏𝒅 depicts humans herding animals, evidence of early pastoral life. Hunting, fishing, and gathering were common, but agriculture gradually took hold. By around 5500 BCE, small Nile Valley communities had developed stable farming systems and domesticated animals. These early societies are identified by their material culture: pottery styles, tools, jewelry, and burial practices. One of the earliest known cultures was the Badarian culture, centered in Upper Egypt. Likely originating in the western desert, the Badarians produced remarkably fine ceramics, stone tools, and early copper objects. Their burials show growing social differentiation, suggesting the emergence of elites. They cultivated grain, raised livestock, and traded goods along the Nile, laying the foundations for more complex societies. The Badarian period gave way to the Naqada culture, divided into three phases: Naqada Pres, Amratian, Naqada II, Gerzian, Naqada III, Samainian. Each phase marked increasing political power, technological sophistication, and regional influence. During Naqada I, Egyptians imported obsidian from Ethiopia to craft sharp blades, showing early long-distance trade networks. Naqada II witnessed expanding trade with the Levant and Mesopotamia, as well as growing wealth among elites. Decorative stone vases, elaborate pottery, and cosmetic palettes became common. By Naqada III, Egypt was no longer a collection of villages. It was a civilization in formation. Power centers emerged at Nekhen and later Abydos, where rulers controlled resources, organized labor, and expanded influence northward along the Nile. Toward the end of the pre-dynastic period, Egyptians began using symbolic markings to record ownership, rituals, and events. These early signs evolved into hieroglyphic writing, one of the world's first complete writing systems. Writing allowed rulers to record history, manage resources, issue commands, and reinforce religious ideology. It became a tool of power, preserved by a growing class of trained scribes. The early dynastic period, the birth of the Egyptian state, c. 3150–2686 BCE. A famous artifact known as the Narmer palette depicts a ruler wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, symbolizing unification. Whether Narmer and Menes were the same person remains debated, but the political reality is clear. Egypt became a unified state. The capital was established at Memphis, strategically located near the Nile Delta, allowing control over agriculture, trade routes, and labor. Kings built elaborate mastaba tombs, especially at Abydos, reinforcing royal authority even in death. The institution of kingship became sacred, and the pharaoh's role as mediator between gods and people was firmly established. This centralized authority enabled control over land, labor, and resources, critical elements for Egypt's survival and expansion. The Old Kingdom represents one of the most iconic periods in Egyptian history. Fueled by agricultural abundance and efficient administration, Egypt entered an age of monumental construction. Skilled architects, engineers, and laborers, organized by the state, built stone temples, pyramids, and causeways unlike anything the world had seen. The pyramids of Giza, including those of Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure, symbolized royal power, divine authority, and cosmic order. The Great Sphinx, carved from limestone, guarded this sacred landscape. A powerful bureaucracy managed taxation, irrigation, and labor. Farmers worked state projects during flood seasons, while scribes recorded everything, from harvest yields to workforce assignments. However, the system carried a cost. Over time, land grants to temples and officials weakened the central economy. Regional governors, known as nomarchs, gained power and autonomy. When severe droughts struck between 2200 and 2150 BCE, the weakened state could no longer cope. The collapse of central authority led to famine, political fragmentation, and localized conflict. Egypt entered its first major period of instability. Yet this era was not total collapse. With no strong pharaoh, local rulers controlled their own resources. Provinces became culturally vibrant, producing richer burials and regional artistic styles. Ordinary people gained more visibility in death and religious expression. Two rival powers emerged: Heracleopolis, controlling Lower Egypt; Thebes, rising in Upper Egypt under the 𝒑𝒓 family. Their rivalry set the stage for reunification. The Middle Kingdom, renewal and renaissance, 2134 to 1690 BCE. Around 2055 BCE, 𝒂𝒓𝒂𝒏𝒚𝒍 of Thebes defeated his rivals and reunified Egypt, ushering in the Middle Kingdom, a golden age of stability, expansion, and cultural growth. Later kings, particularly under the 12th dynasty, strengthened the state further. Amenemhat I moved the capital to 𝒐𝒊𝒣, near the fertile Fayum region, launching ambitious irrigation and land reclamation projects. Egypt expanded militarily into Nubia, securing gold mines and quarries. Defensive fortifications known as the Walls of the Ruler were built to protect against foreign threats. Art and literature flourished. Sculpture became more realistic and expressive. Written works explored morality, leadership, suffering, and hope. Religion shifted toward greater personal piety, allowing ordinary Egyptians to seek divine favor beyond royal rituals. The Middle Kingdom refined Egyptian civilization, politically, culturally, and spiritually, setting the stage for the empire-building centuries to come. Egypt had fallen before. But this time the throne was not empty. It was occupied by outsiders. For the first time in its long history, the land of the pharaohs was ruled by foreign kings who spoke different languages, brought new weapons, and shattered the illusion of eternal stability. From this period of humiliation and resistance would rise a militarized Egypt, stronger, more aggressive, and more ambitious than ever before. This was the age that reshaped Egypt forever. As the power of the Middle Kingdom faded, Egypt fractured once again. Central authority weakened, regional rulers gained independence, and the unity that once defined the Nile Valley dissolved. Into this instability came the Hyksos, a Western Asian people who had gradually settled in the Nile Delta. Around 1785 BCE, they seized political control of northern Egypt and established their capital at Avaris. Though later Egyptian accounts portrayed the Hyksos as brutal invaders, archaeology paints a more complex picture. The Hyksos adopted Egyptian administrative systems, royal titles, and religious customs. They ruled as kings, not conquerors, yet they were still foreigners. The native Egyptian court was forced to retreat south to Thebes, reduced to vassal status. Pharaohs who once claimed divine authority now paid tribute to rulers of foreign origin. Egypt was divided. To the north ruled the Hyksos. To the south lay Thebes. And beyond the southern frontier stood Kush, a powerful Nubian kingdom aligned with Hyksos interests. For generations, Thebes endured humiliation, gathering strength in silence. The War of Liberation and the rise of Ahmose. Resistance did not come quickly, but when it came, it was relentless. Over decades, Theban rulers built military capacity, studied Hyksos technology, and prepared for war. The conflict that followed lasted more than 30 years, transforming Egypt into a hardened warrior state. The decisive figure was Ahmose I. Through a series of brutal campaigns, Ahmose crushed Hyksos strongholds, stormed Avaris, and pursued fleeing enemies into southern Canaan. By c. 1550 BCE, foreign rule was eradicated from Egyptian soil. Ahmose I became the founder of the 18th dynasty, and under his reign, Egypt was reborn, not as a passive river civilization, but as a military empire. From this moment forward, warfare, expansion, and defense would dominate Egyptian policy. The new kingdom marked the peak of Egyptian power. Pharaohs secured borders, reorganized the army, and forged diplomatic ties with major Near Eastern powers including Mitanni, Assyria, and city-states of Canaan. Under Thutmose I and his grandson Thutmose III, Egypt expanded aggressively. Military campaigns pushed deep into Nubia and Syria, creating the largest empire Egypt had ever known. Gold from Nubia, timber from Lebanon, and bronze from Asia flowed into the Nile Valley. Egypt was no longer reacting to threats. It was projecting power. Hatshepsut, the woman who ruled as king. Between the reigns of warrior pharaohs rose one of Egypt's most remarkable rulers, Hatshepsut. Defying tradition, she declared herself pharaoh, adopting full royal regalia. Her reign focused not on conquest, but on prosperity. She restored temples damaged during earlier conflicts and launched legendary trade expeditions to Punt, bringing back incense, gold, exotic animals, and wealth. Her architectural legacy, especially her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, remains one of Egypt's greatest achievements. Though later rulers attempted to erase her memory, Hatshepsut's reign proved that legitimacy in Egypt came not from gender, but from power and success. By 1425 BCE, Egypt's empire stretched from northwest Syria to the Fourth Cataract of the Nile. Loyalty was enforced through military presence and diplomatic marriage alliances. The god Amun rose to supreme importance. Massive building campaigns transformed Karnak into the largest religious complex ever built. Temples glorified both the gods and the pharaohs who ruled in their name. Egypt stood unmatched, wealthy, feared, and confident. Around 1350 BCE, stability shattered once more. Pharaoh Amenhotep IV ascended the throne and soon took the name Akhenaten. He rejected centuries of religious tradition, elevating the sun disk Aten above all other gods. Temples were closed. Priests were stripped of power. The capital was abandoned and rebuilt at Akhetaten, modern Amarna. Art changed dramatically, portraying elongated bodies and intimate family scenes. Religion became centralized, rigid, and deeply unpopular. After Akhenaten's death, Egypt moved swiftly to undo his revolution. Tutankhamun, followed by Eye and Horemheb, restored the old gods and attempted to erase Akhenaten's legacy entirely. The Amarna period left Egypt weakened, politically and spiritually. Ramesses II and the Age of Monumental Power. In 1279 BCE, Ramesses II took the throne and ruled for over 6 decades. He built relentlessly: temples, statues, obelisks, and cities. His image dominated Egypt like no ruler before him. Militarily, he clashed with the Hittite Empire at the Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest chariot battles in history. Though the battle ended in stalemate, Ramesses negotiated the world's first recorded peace treaty, securing Egypt's northern frontier. Yet even under Ramesses, cracks appeared. External threats intensified. Libyan tribes and the mysterious Sea Peoples attacked Egypt's borders. Though repelled, Egypt gradually lost control of Canaan. Corruption spread, tomb robbery increased, and power shifted dangerously toward the priesthood. After the death of Ramesses XVIII, Egypt fractured once more. The north was ruled from Tanis, while the south fell under the control of the high priests of Amun at Thebes. Pharaohs existed, but real power was divided. Libyan settlers in the delta gained autonomy. In 945 BCE, 𝒂𝒐 the Free founded a Libyan dynasty that ruled Egypt for nearly 2 centuries. Yet unity remained fragile. From the south came a new force: Kush, the Kushite pharaohs, and the return of the pyramids. In 727 BCE, the Kushite king Pi marched north, reunifying Egypt under the 25th dynasty. Under rulers like Taharqa, Egypt experienced a revival of tradition. Temples were restored, monuments rebuilt, and for the first time in centuries, pyramids rose again, this time primarily in Nubia. The Kushite pharaohs ruled an empire nearly as vast as the New Kingdom, but their power drew the attention of a ruthless enemy: Assyrian invasions and the fall of Kushite rule. By 700 BCE, Assyria dominated the Near East. Conflict was inevitable. Between 671 and 667 BCE, Assyrian armies invaded Egypt, capturing Memphis and sacking Thebes. Kushite rulers were driven back into Nubia. Egypt was once again occupied by foreign power. After the Assyrians withdrew, local rulers known as the Sate dynasty restored partial independence. Psamtik IV, aided by Greek mercenaries, expelled Assyrian forces and rebuilt Egypt's economy. Greek influence expanded, especially in Naucratis, Egypt's Greek trading hub. But in 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II conquered Egypt, ruling it as a satrapy. Though Egypt rebelled repeatedly, true independence was brief. By 332 BCE, Persian control collapsed when Alexander the Great entered Egypt unopposed. Alexander's successors, the Ptolemies, ruled from Alexandria, a city that became the intellectual heart of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria, the lighthouse, and vast trade networks defined the era. Greek and Egyptian cultures merged. Gods were syncretized. Pharaohs spoke Greek but ruled as Egyptian kings. Yet rebellion, family conflict, and Roman interference destabilized the kingdom. After the defeat of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony, Egypt became a Roman province. Rome relied on Egyptian grain. Taxes were heavy. Rebellion was crushed. Christianity spread, eventually replacing ancient religious traditions. By 391 CE, pagan temples were closed. Hieroglyphs faded from memory. Egypt's ancient religion slowly disappeared. When Arab forces conquered Egypt in 642 CE, the last echoes of pharaonic civilization had already fallen silent. At the heart of ancient Egyptian civilization stood a powerful and highly centralized state, one of the earliest of its kind in human history. Egypt was not merely a land ruled by kings, it was governed by a sacred system in which political authority, religion, and economics were inseparably linked. The stability of this system allowed Egypt to endure for more than 3 millennia, surviving internal crises, foreign invasions, and dynastic changes. The pharaoh was the absolute ruler of the land, both in political theory and religious belief. He was considered a living god on earth, the divine intermediary between the human world and the gods. In principle, all land, people, crops, animals, and resources belonged to him. This belief granted the state immense control over production, labor, and wealth distribution. The pharaoh was also the supreme military commander, chief judge, and head of government, responsible for maintaining harmony, order, and cosmic balance, known as Ma'at. Yet despite his divine status, the pharaoh did not rule alone. The effective functioning of the Egyptian state depended on a vast and disciplined administrative structure that reached into every village, field, and temple across the Nile Valley. The daily operations of the kingdom were managed by a sophisticated bureaucracy that allowed the pharaoh's authority to be exercised across great distances. At the top of this administrative system stood the vizier, the pharaoh's chief official and second in command. Acting as the king's representative, the vizier oversaw nearly every aspect of state affairs, including land surveys, taxation, agricultural production, building projects, legal courts, and state archives. Egypt was divided into administrative districts known as nomes. At various times, there were up to 42 nomes stretching from the Nile Delta in the north to Nubia in the south. Each nome was governed by a nomarch, who was responsible for collecting taxes, organizing labor, enforcing laws, and reporting directly to the vizier. This structure allowed the central government to maintain firm control while still adapting to local conditions. Temples played a crucial economic role beyond their religious functions. They were major landowners, employers, and storage centers. Temple complexes controlled vast agricultural estates and operated granaries and treasuries where surplus grain and goods were stored. Overseers carefully recorded incoming and outgoing supplies, redistributing food to workers, priests, and officials. In many ways, temples functioned as economic institutions as much as sacred spaces. The Egyptian economy was largely state-controlled and centrally planned. Although coinage was not used until the late period, Egypt developed an advanced barter-based system that functioned with remarkable efficiency. Grain served as the primary medium of exchange, while the deben, a standard unit of weight made of copper or silver, was used to measure value. Goods and services were priced according to fixed lists recorded by scribes. Workers were paid in rations rather than money. A basic laborer could earn several sacks of grain per month, while skilled workers and overseers received larger allocations. Prices were standardized across the kingdom, allowing grain to be exchanged for clothing, tools, livestock, or other necessities. By the 5th century BCE, foreign traders introduced coined money into Egypt, and over time, coinage became more common, especially in international trade. Ancient Egyptian society was highly structured, with social status clearly defined and publicly displayed. At the base of society were farmers, who made up the vast majority of the population. Although they worked the land, the crops they produced typically belonged to the state, temples, or noble families that owned the land. Farmers were also required to pay labor taxes, which often took the form of seasonal work on irrigation systems, roads, temples, or royal monuments through a system known as corvée labor. Above the farmers were artisans and craftsmen, whose skills earned them higher status. These individuals produced pottery, furniture, jewelry, statues, tools, and elaborate tomb decorations. Despite their expertise, most craftsmen worked under state or temple supervision and were paid directly from the treasury. Scribes occupied a privileged position in Egyptian society. Literacy was rare, and the ability to read and write hieroglyphs or hieratic script granted access to power. Scribes and officials formed the administrative elite, sometimes referred to as the white kilt class, due to their fine linen clothing. Their status was immortalized in tomb reliefs, inscriptions, and literature. Below the nobility but above common laborers were priests, physicians, engineers, and architects, specialists who underwent extensive training. Their knowledge, especially in medicine, mathematics, and engineering, was highly respected. The nature of slavery in ancient Egypt remains debated among scholars. What existed more closely resembled bonded or indentured labor rather than the chattel slavery known from later periods. Enslaved individuals could own property, marry, receive medical care, and in some cases purchase their freedom or rise in social status. One of the most remarkable aspects of ancient Egyptian society was its legal recognition of gender equality. Men and women, regardless of social class, were considered equal under the law. Even the poorest peasant could petition the vizier or royal court for justice. Women enjoyed legal rights that were exceptional for the ancient world. They could own, buy, and sell property, enter contracts, inherit wealth, initiate divorce, and represent themselves in court. Marriage contracts were common and often protected women financially by clearly outlining the husband's obligations in the event of divorce. Married couples could jointly own property, and women retained control over their own assets. Compared to women in ancient Greece, Rome, and many later societies, Egyptian women had significantly greater autonomy and opportunity. Some women rose to extraordinary power. Hatshepsut ruled as pharaoh during the New Kingdom, adopting full royal titles and iconography. Cleopatra VII later became one of the most influential figures of the ancient world. Other women held religious authority as divine wives of Amun, controlling wealth and wielding political influence. Despite these rights, most women did not participate extensively in state administration. Education was more accessible to men, and official government roles were largely male-dominated, with women often occupying secondary positions in temples or royal households. The legal system of ancient Egypt was rooted in the concept of ma'at, which embodied truth, balance, justice, and cosmic order. The pharaoh was the ultimate guardian of ma'at and the highest legal authority in the land. Rather than relying on written legal codes, Egyptian law was based on precedent, moral reasoning, and practical judgment. Local courts, known as kenbet, handled minor disputes such as property disagreements, debts, and family matters. These courts were often composed of elders and officials familiar with local customs. More serious crimes, including murder, major land disputes, and tomb robbery, were referred to higher courts, sometimes called the Great Kenbet, presided over by the vizier or the pharaoh. Plaintiffs and defendants represented themselves and were required to swear oaths affirming their honesty. Court proceedings were meticulously recorded by scribes, preserving complaints, testimonies, and verdicts for future reference. In some cases, the state acted as both prosecutor and judge. Interrogation could involve physical punishment to extract confessions, reflecting the harsh realities of ancient justice. Punishments varied depending on the severity of the crime. Minor offenses could result in fines, beatings, mutilation, or exile. Serious crimes such as murder or tomb robbery were punished by execution, sometimes through decapitation, drowning, or impalement. Punishment could extend to family members in extreme cases. During the New Kingdom, religious oracles became influential in legal decisions. Priests posed yes or no questions to gods, whose responses, interpreted through ritual movements, were believed to reveal divine judgment. Agriculture was the foundation of Egypt's wealth and stability. The civilization's success was made possible by the Nile River, whose annual flooding deposited rich, fertile silt along its banks. This natural cycle transformed the desert into productive farmland and ensured consistent food supplies. Egyptians organized their agricultural calendar around 3 seasons: Aqet, flooding; Pere, planting; and Shimu, harvesting. During the flood season, fields were submerged. Once the waters receded, farmers plowed the land and planted crops, using irrigation canals to manage water flow. Harvesting took place in the dry months, with crops cut using sickles, threshed to separate grain from straw, and winnowed to remove chaff. Grain was then stored, ground into flour, or brewed into beer. The primary crops were emmer wheat and barley, used to produce bread and beer, the staples of the Egyptian diet. Flax was grown for linen, papyrus for writing material, and a wide range of vegetables and fruits were cultivated in garden plots near homes and temples. Animals were essential to Egyptian economic life, religious belief, and daily survival. Egyptians viewed humans, animals, and plants as interconnected parts of a cosmic whole. Cattle were the most valuable livestock, symbolizing wealth and prestige. Herds were regularly counted for taxation. Sheep, goats, and pigs supplemented food supplies, while poultry such as ducks and geese were raised on farms. The Nile provided abundant fish, and beekeeping supplied honey and wax. Donkeys and oxen were vital for farming and transport. Horses, introduced by the Hyksos, transformed warfare, while camels were only widely used in later periods. Pets such as cats, dogs, and monkeys were common, while exotic animals like lions were reserved for royalty. Animal worship grew especially popular in later periods, with sacred animals bred in large numbers for ritual purposes, representing gods such as Bastet and Thoth. Egypt's natural wealth extended beyond agriculture. The land was rich in stone, metals, and minerals that supported monument building, tool-making, and artistic production. Limestone, granite, basalt, and sandstone were quarried to construct temples, statues, and pyramids. Gold mining, especially in Nubia, fueled Egypt's power and prestige. Copper was essential for tools and weapons, while lead, flint, and semi-precious stones were widely used. Minerals like sulfur were even incorporated into cosmetics and medicine. Large state-organized expeditions ventured into deserts and distant regions to extract these resources, demonstrating Egypt's advanced logistical and administrative capabilities. Trade was one of the silent engines that powered ancient Egyptian civilization. While the Nile provided food, stability, and internal transport, Egypt lacked many critical raw materials. To fill these gaps, the Egyptians built long-distance trade networks that connected Africa, the Near East, and the Mediterranean world, centuries before global trade became the norm. From as early as the pre-dynastic period, Egyptians traded with Nubia to the south, a region rich in gold, incense, ebony, and exotic animal products. Nubian gold, in particular, became the backbone of Egypt's wealth and international influence. Trade routes along the Nile allowed Egyptian expeditions to penetrate deep into Africa, establishing Egypt not merely as a local power, but as a continental one. Evidence also shows early trade with Palestine and the Levant. Palestinian-style oil jars found in First Dynasty royal tombs confirm active exchange. Egypt even established colonial outposts in southern Canaan. One of the earliest known Egyptian settlements outside the Nile Valley was Tel Es-Sakan in modern-day Gaza, founded in the late 4th millennium BCE. This site likely functioned as a strategic trading and administrative hub, securing Egypt's access to Levantine goods. During the reign of Narmer, Egypt produced pottery in Canaan itself and exported it back home, demonstrating both cultural influence and logistical sophistication. By the Second Dynasty, trade with the city of Byblos became essential. Byblos supplied high-quality cedar wood, an invaluable resource in a land almost entirely devoid of large timber. Cedar was used for ships, coffins, palace doors, and monumental construction. By the 5th Dynasty, Egypt's trade networks expanded even further. The famous expeditions to the land of Punt, likely located in the Horn of Africa, brought back gold, aromatic resins, ebony, ivory, incense, and exotic animals such as baboons and monkeys. These expeditions were not merely commercial, they were political and symbolic, reinforcing Egypt's image as a divinely favored empire connected to distant and mysterious lands. Egypt also relied heavily on Anatolia for tin, a crucial component in bronze production, while copper was obtained both locally and through trade. Without these imports, Egypt's military and tool-making industries would have stalled. Lapis lazuli, a deep blue gemstone prized for jewelry and ritual objects, was imported from as far away as present-day Afghanistan, illustrating just how far Egypt's trade networks reached. Across the Mediterranean, Egypt traded with Crete and Greece, exchanging grain and luxury goods for olive oil, pottery, and artistic influences. Through trade, Egypt absorbed foreign ideas while maintaining its own cultural identity, strengthening its economy and expanding its global reach. Origins and development. The Egyptian language stands as one of the most remarkable linguistic achievements in human history. It belongs to the northern branch of the Afro-Asiatic language family, closely related to Berber and Semitic languages. Its deep African roots are clear, with linguistic ties to Chadic languages in West and Central Africa, Cushitic languages in Northeast Africa, and Ethio-Semitic languages spoken in Ethiopia and Eritrea. What makes Egyptian truly exceptional is its longevity. It is the longest continuously recorded language in history, written from around 3200 BCE through the Middle Ages, and spoken in evolving forms for thousands of years. The language passed through several major stages: Old Egyptian, Middle Egyptian, often called Classical Egyptian, Late Egyptian, Demotic, and finally Coptic. Middle Egyptian became the language of literature, religion, and monumental inscriptions, and continued to be used long after it was no longer spoken in daily life. Although inscriptions do not reveal strong dialect differences before the Coptic stage, spoken Egyptian likely varied regionally, particularly between Memphis in the north and Thebes in the south. Over time, Egyptian grammar evolved significantly. Early Egyptian was a synthetic language relying on inflections, but later forms became more analytic, introducing definite and indefinite articles and shifting word order from verb, subject-object to subject-verb-object. These changes made the language more flexible and expressive. Ancient Egyptian possessed a complex sound system similar to other Afro-Asiatic languages. It included emphatic and pharyngeal consonants, voiced and voiceless stops, and affricates. The vowel system expanded over time, especially in late Egyptian. Words were built around biliteral and triliteral consonantal roots, a system shared with Semitic languages. Meaning was modified through prefixes, suffixes, and grammatical context. Verbs were conjugated according to person, but when the subject was explicitly stated, suffixes were often unnecessary. Adjectives were commonly formed from nouns through a process known as nisbation, while sentence structure varied depending on whether the sentence was verbal, nominal, or adjectival. Negation was handled through specific particles, and emphasis could be achieved by shifting word order. Writing in ancient Egypt was both a practical tool and a sacred art. Hieroglyphic writing appeared around 3000 BCE and consisted of hundreds of symbols. These symbols could represent sounds, entire words, or serve as determinatives that clarified meaning. Hieroglyphs were primarily used for monumental inscriptions, temples, tombs, and statues, where beauty and symbolism mattered as much as clarity. For everyday use, scribes employed hieratic, a cursive script that allowed for faster writing on papyrus. Hieratic was later replaced by demotic, an even more simplified and efficient script used for administration, business, and literature. The Rosetta Stone, created in 196 BCE, featured the same text written in hieroglyphs, demotic, and Greek. Its discovery in the modern era allowed scholars like Thomas Young and Jean-François Champollion to finally decipher Egyptian writing in the 19th century, unlocking thousands of years of history. By the 1st century CE, Coptic emerged, using a modified Greek alphabet with demotic elements. While hieroglyphs survived ceremonially into the 4th century, knowledge of them gradually disappeared as traditional temples were closed. Coptic, however, survives today in the liturgy of the Egyptian Orthodox Church and has influenced modern Egyptian Arabic. Writing in Egypt was closely linked to power, religion, and knowledge. The scribal profession operated through institutions known as the pharaohs, or House of Life, centers that functioned as libraries, schools, laboratories, and archives. Some of Egypt's earliest texts were funerary, such as the pyramid texts and coffin texts, intended to guide the dead in the afterlife. Over time, Egyptian literature expanded to include wisdom texts, autobiographies, love poetry, historical narratives, and fictional tales. The story of Sinuhe stands as one of the masterpieces of world literature, exploring exile, identity, and loyalty. The Westcar Papyrus offers magical tales told to King Khufu, while the instruction of Amenemope presents moral teachings that later influenced biblical literature. During later periods, demotic literature flourished, producing stories set in Egypt's glorious past. Even under foreign rule, Egyptian writers continued to celebrate their heritage through storytelling, preserving cultural memory across centuries. Daily life. For most Egyptians, life revolved around farming and family. Homes were built of mud brick, designed to stay cool in the heat. They typically housed extended families and included a simple kitchen with grinding stones and bread ovens. Furniture was minimal: reed mats, stools, low tables, and raised beds. Cleanliness was highly valued. Egyptians bathed frequently, shaved their bodies, and used oils and perfumes. Clothing was made from linen, usually white, while wigs, cosmetics, and jewelry were popular among the elite. Children went unclothed until adolescence, when rites of passage marked adulthood. Music, dance, and festivals were central to social life. Instruments included flutes, harps, drums, tambourines, and later imported lutes and lyres. The sistrum played a vital role in religious ceremonies. Leisure activities included board games such as senet and hounds and jackals, sports, wrestling, hunting, and boating. The village of Deir el-Medina, home to royal tomb workers, provides an unparalleled glimpse into daily life, labor organization, and social relations over centuries. Ancient Egyptian cuisine remained remarkably consistent over time. Bread and beer formed the dietary foundation, supplemented by vegetables like onions and garlic, fruits such as dates and figs, and occasional meat or fish. Wine was consumed more frequently by the elite, but appeared at festivals across all classes. Food preservation methods included salting, drying, and smoking. Meals were simple but nutritious, reflecting the agricultural abundance of the Nile Valley. Ancient Egyptian architecture remains one of humanity's greatest achievements. State-sponsored building projects served religious, political, and ideological purposes, reinforcing the pharaoh's power and divine authority. While most domestic structures were built from mud brick and have not survived, monumental stone architecture endures. Early temples were simple enclosed halls, but New Kingdom architects developed the classic temple layout: pylons, open courtyards, hypostyle halls, and sanctuaries. Tomb architecture evolved from mastabas to step pyramids, culminating in the true pyramids of the Old and Middle Kingdoms. Later rulers favored hidden rock-cut tombs, especially in the Valley of the Kings, to protect royal burials. The pyramid form never disappeared entirely, continuing in private tomb chapels and Nubian royal pyramids. Through architecture, Egypt expressed permanence, order, and its vision of eternity, etched in stone for the ages. Ancient Egyptian art was never created purely for decoration. It was a powerful visual language designed to serve religious, political, and social purposes. For more than 3,500 years, Egyptian artists followed a remarkably consistent artistic system developed during the Old Kingdom. These rules governed proportions, colors, posture, symbolism, and composition, ensuring that art reinforced cosmic order, ma'at, rather than individual creativity. Scenes were composed using simple lines, clearly defined shapes, and flat blocks of color. Figures were typically shown in a composite view, heads and legs in profile, eyes and shoulders facing forward. This was not artistic limitation, but intentional clarity. Each body part was shown from its most recognizable angle. Depth and perspective were largely avoided, as realism was less important than symbolic meaning. Text and imagery were inseparable. Hieroglyphs often functioned visually as part of the artwork itself, while images could also be read symbolically like text. On temple walls, tombs, coffins, stelae, and statues, images reinforced written prayers, spells, and historical narratives. A single wall could tell a story of power, faith, and eternity without requiring spoken words. One of the earliest and most famous examples of this visual storytelling is the Narmer palette, which records the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. The figures depicted are not only images but symbolic statements about kingship, divine authority, and political order. Egyptian art functioned as propaganda, theology, and historical record, executed with precision and consistency. Egyptian artisans worked with a wide range of materials, each chosen for symbolic, economic, or practical reasons. Stone was the most prestigious medium, associated with permanence and eternity. Statues and reliefs carved from limestone, sandstone, granite, and basalt were intended to last forever, preserving the identity and power of gods, kings, and elites. Wood was also widely used, especially for coffins, furniture, statues, and everyday objects. While less durable, wood was easier to carve and more accessible. Egyptian artists skillfully transformed simple materials into refined works of art. Color played a vital role in Egyptian visual culture. Pigments were derived from natural minerals, red and yellow from iron oxides, blue and green from copper compounds, black from soot or charcoal, and white from limestone or gypsum. These pigments were mixed with binders such as gum arabic and stored in dried cakes, which could be rehydrated when needed. Colors were symbolic rather than realistic. Green represented regeneration and rebirth. Black symbolized fertility and the life-giving Nile silt. Red conveyed chaos or power, and gold represented divinity and eternity. Art was designed to communicate meaning, not imitate nature. Art played a central role in death and the afterlife. Funerary art was created to protect, sustain, and guide the deceased in their eternal journey. Pharaohs, nobles, and commoners alike believed that images could become real in the afterlife. Tomb walls were covered with scenes of farming, hunting, banquets, religious rituals, and family life. These images were not nostalgic, they were functional. Egyptians believed that whatever was depicted would come into existence for the deceased beyond death. During the Middle Kingdom, small wooden and clay models became common burial goods. These models represented houses, gardens, boats, workshops, granaries, and even military units. They served as substitutes for real servants and possessions, ensuring that the deceased would never lack food, labor, or shelter. Shabti statues were among the most important funerary objects. These small figurines were inscribed with spells from funerary texts and were believed to perform manual labor on behalf of the deceased in the afterlife. Even common citizens could afford simple versions, demonstrating that belief in the afterlife crossed class boundaries. Despite its overall consistency, Egyptian art was not completely static. Political upheaval and cultural contact occasionally influenced artistic expression. After the Hyksos occupation during the Second Intermediate Period, foreign artistic elements entered Egypt, including Minoan-style frescoes found at Avaris, featuring naturalistic movement and vibrant colors unlike traditional Egyptian norms. The most dramatic artistic shift occurred during the Amarna period under Pharaoh Akhenaten. Rejecting centuries of convention, Amarna art depicted elongated limbs, narrow chests, full lips, and exaggerated facial features. The royal family was shown in intimate domestic scenes, kissing children, sitting informally, and worshipping the 𝒂𝒐𝒏𝒚 together. This artistic revolution reflected Akhenaten's radical religious reforms, which elevated the 𝒂𝒐𝒏𝒚 as the supreme deity. After his death, the Amarna style was quickly abandoned, and traditional artistic conventions were restored. The episode highlights how deeply art was tied to ideology and power. Religion permeated every aspect of ancient Egyptian life. From the earliest dynasties, Egyptians believed the universe was governed by divine forces that required balance and harmony. Pharaohs ruled by divine right, serving as intermediaries between the gods and humanity. The Egyptian pantheon included hundreds of deities, each associated with natural forces, cosmic principles, or aspects of daily life. Gods could be benevolent or dangerous, protective or destructive. Egyptians did not attempt to systematize their theology. Contradictions were accepted as different expressions of divine truth. Major gods such as Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Anubis, and Thoth played central roles in mythology and ritual. Osiris represented death and resurrection, Isis symbolized magic and motherhood, and Horus embodied kingship. Anubis presided over mummification and burial rites, guiding souls through the afterlife. Gods were worshipped in temples administered by priests acting on behalf of the pharaoh. At the heart of each temple stood a cult statue housed within a sanctuary. This statue was believed to be the physical dwelling of the god. Temples were not open congregational spaces. Ordinary people rarely entered the inner sanctuaries. Instead, rituals were performed daily by priests, who washed, clothed, and presented offerings to the deity. On special festival days, the god's statue was carried in procession, allowing the public to witness divine presence. Private worship was equally important. Egyptians prayed in their homes, kept household shrines, and wore amulets for protection. During the New Kingdom, religious practices became more personal, and oracles emerged as a way for individuals to seek direct guidance from the gods. Egyptians believed humans were composed of multiple spiritual elements. These included the K, life force, Ba, personality, Akh, transfigured spirit, shadow, and name. The heart was considered the seat of intelligence and morality, not the brain. After death, the soul faced judgment in the hall of Ma'at. The heart was weighed against the feather of truth. A worthy soul was allowed to live eternally among the blessed dead. An unworthy soul faced annihilation, devoured by the fearsome Ammit. Preserving the body was essential. Without a physical form, the spiritual components could not reunite, and eternal life would be impossible. Burial practices evolved over thousands of years, but always centered on immortality. Early burials relied on natural desert preservation. Over time, artificial mummification developed into a sophisticated ritual science. By the New Kingdom, mummification took approximately 70 days. Organs were removed and preserved separately in canopic jars. The brain was extracted through the nose, and the body was dried using natron salts. Linen wrappings, amulets, and spells ensured protection. Even the poor were buried with grave goods, while elites were surrounded by luxury items, food offerings, texts, and Shabti figurines. Tombs were visited by relatives who brought offerings and recited prayers long after burial. Egypt's military evolved from small militia forces into a professional standing army. It protected trade routes, defended borders, and enabled imperial expansion. Fortresses along the Nile and Sinai secured access to Nubia and the Levant. Weapons included bows, spears, shields, and later bronze swords such as the 𝒂𝒊𝒂𝒏𝒅. Chariots, introduced by the Hyksos, transformed warfare during the New Kingdom. Soldiers were drawn from the population, supplemented by Nubian and Libyan mercenaries. Pharaohs were depicted leading armies, reinforcing their image as warrior kings chosen by the gods. Ancient Egypt achieved remarkable advances in science and technology through practical observation rather than theoretical experimentation. Medical texts, such as the Edwin Smith and Ebers papyri, reveal detailed knowledge of anatomy, surgery, and pharmacology. Egyptians developed a decimal system, geometry for land measurement, and architectural mathematics that enabled monumental construction. They also created faience, Egyptian blue pigment, and advanced glassworking techniques. Glass objects in vibrant colors, blue, green, red, yellow, and purple, demonstrate technical mastery and aesthetic sophistication. Whether imported or locally produced, glass was shaped with precision and artistry. Through innovation, observation, and spiritual belief, ancient Egyptian civilization built a legacy that continues to influence art, religion, science, and culture across the world. The medical challenges faced by ancient Egyptians were deeply shaped by their natural environment. Life along the Nile brought prosperity, but it also exposed the population to serious health risks. Malaria thrived in marshy floodplains, while parasitic diseases such as schistosomiasis damaged the liver and intestines. Dangerous animals like crocodiles and hippos posed daily threats, especially to fishermen, farmers, and traders who depended on the river for survival. Physical labor was relentless. Farming, quarrying, monument construction, and military service placed constant strain on the spine, joints, and muscles. Traumatic injuries from falls, collapsing structures, warfare, and animal attacks were common. Even daily food preparation contributed to health problems. Stone-ground flour contained grit and sand that gradually wore down teeth, exposing nerves and causing abscesses. Tooth decay itself was relatively rare, but dental pain was widespread. Social status influenced health outcomes. Wealthier Egyptians consumed diets high in honey, dates, and sweetened bread, which contributed to gum disease and obesity. Several mummies from elite burials show clear signs of excess weight and cardiovascular stress, contrasting sharply with the idealized athletic figures painted on tomb walls. Life expectancy was low by modern standards. Adult men lived on average to about 35 years, while women lived slightly less, largely due to complications from childbirth. Reaching adulthood itself was a challenge, as nearly one-third of children died in infancy. Ancient Egyptian physicians were highly respected throughout the ancient world. Their reputation spread as far as the Near East, and some doctors were summoned to foreign courts. One of the most famous figures in Egyptian medical tradition was Imhotep, architect of the Step Pyramid, and later deified as a god of healing. Medicine in Egypt was highly specialized. According to Herodotus, doctors focused on specific areas of the body. Some treated only eye diseases, others specialized in stomach ailments, dentistry, or trauma care. This degree of specialization was unusual for the ancient world and reflects an advanced understanding of medical practice. Physicians were trained at institutions known as the pharaohs, or House of Life. These centers functioned as libraries, schools, and research institutions. Medical knowledge was recorded on papyri written in hieratic script, preserving generations of accumulated experience. The most famous of these texts, the Edwin Smith Papyrus, reveals a surprisingly rational approach to trauma medicine, emphasizing diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment. Egyptian medicine combined empirical observation with religious belief. Physicians treated wounds using bandages made of linen, raw meat to stop bleeding, and honey for its antibacterial properties. Honey, copper salts, and moldy bread were commonly used to prevent infection, methods now recognized for their antimicrobial effects. Pain relief was achieved using natural substances such as opium, thyme, and belladonna. Garlic and onions were consumed regularly to strengthen the body and were believed to relieve respiratory problems such as asthma. Burn treatments included ointments made from animal fat, honey, and milk, specifically milk from mothers of male infants, which carried symbolic significance. Surgical procedures included stitching wounds, setting broken bones, draining abscesses, and amputating infected limbs when necessary. Surgeons recognized limits to their abilities and classified injuries into 3 categories: treatable, contestable, and untreatable. In cases deemed hopeless, physicians focused on easing suffering rather than attempting cures. Prayer and magic were often integrated into treatment. Deities such as Isis and Sekhmet were invoked for healing, reflecting the Egyptian belief that illness could have both physical and spiritual causes. Ancient Egypt was not only a river civilization, but also a maritime power. As early as 3000 BC, Egyptians had mastered advanced shipbuilding techniques. The oldest known planked ships, discovered at Abydos, were constructed using wooden planks sewn together with ropes made from plant fibers. Reeds and grasses were packed between planks to seal seams, demonstrating sophisticated engineering knowledge. One of these Abydos ships measured approximately 75 feet long and likely belonged to an early pharaoh, possibly 𝒑𝒐𝒊𝒄𝙗. These vessels reveal that large-scale ship construction existed centuries before the pyramids. The most famous example of Egyptian shipbuilding is the Khufu ship, discovered buried beside the Great Pyramid of Giza. Measuring over 43 meters long, it was assembled using mortise and tenon joints and sealed with pitch. The ship likely served as a symbolic solar bark, transporting the pharaoh alongside the sun god Ra in the afterlife. Egyptians built large seagoing ships capable of long-distance voyages. These vessels were used extensively for trade with the eastern Mediterranean, particularly the city of Byblos, which supplied high-quality cedar wood. Expeditions also traveled down the Red Sea to the land of Punt, bringing back gold, incense, ebony, ivory, and exotic animals. The term Byblos ship eventually became a general word for large ocean-going vessels, reflecting how central maritime trade was to Egypt's economy. Archaeological discoveries at 𝒂𝒻𝒻 have uncovered ship timbers, anchors, and hundreds of meters of papyrus rope, confirming Egypt's ability to launch ocean expeditions. In 2013, archaeologists identified what is believed to be the world's oldest known harbor at Wadi el-Jarf on the Red Sea coast, dating to the reign of Khufu. This harbor system included storage galleries, ramps, and docks used to support royal maritime projects. Beyond open seas, Egyptians engineered inland waterways to enhance transport and trade. A north-south canal connecting Lake Timsah to the Bala Lakes, dated to the Middle Kingdom, demonstrates early large-scale hydraulic engineering. These canals allowed goods, troops, and building materials to move efficiently across regions, strengthening central control. Mathematics was fundamental to Egyptian administration, architecture, and daily life. The earliest mathematical evidence dates to the pre-dynastic period, showing a fully developed decimal system. Numbers were written using hieroglyphic symbols for powers of 10, repeated as needed to represent values. Texts such as the Rhind Mathematical Papyrus and Moscow Mathematical Papyrus reveal practical problem-solving skills. Egyptians performed addition, subtraction, multiplication and division, calculated areas and volumes, and used fractions extensively, though almost always as unit fractions. Special symbols existed for commonly used fractions, such as 2/3. To simplify calculations, scribes relied on standardized tables and decomposed complex fractions into sums of simpler ones. Egyptian mathematicians applied geometry empirically. They understood right triangles using the 3:4:5 ratio and used geometry to survey land after Nile floods. Their formula for calculating the area of a circle by reducing the diameter by 1/9 and squaring the result produced an approximation of pi that was remarkably accurate. These mathematical skills were essential for constructing temples, pyramids, canals, and monuments with astonishing precision, often without advanced tools. Estimates of Egypt's ancient population suggest around 1 to 1.5 million people during the Old Kingdom, rising to as many as 3 million by the first millennium BC. Population growth fluctuated with climate, Nile flooding patterns, and political stability. Scholars generally agree that the Nile Valley was peopled through long-term interactions among diverse African populations. These included Saharan pastoralists displaced by desertification, Nilotic hunter-gatherers, riverine Nubian groups, and northern African communities, with some influence from the Levant. Recent UNESCO reviews emphasize Upper Egypt as the origin of pharaonic unification, supported by archaeological, linguistic, and anthropological evidence showing strong connections with sub-Saharan Africa. The genetic history of ancient Egypt remains a developing field. Preservation conditions have made ancient DNA difficult to recover, leading to limited data and ongoing debate. Earlier studies focused on later periods, showing genetic continuity between ancient and modern Egyptians and affinities with Levantine populations. A landmark 2025 genome-wide study published in Nature analyzed an Old Kingdom individual from 𝒂𝒐𝒊𝒣, dating to around 2855 to 2570 BC. The genome revealed predominant North African Neolithic ancestry, with approximately 20% linked to the Eastern Fertile Crescent, indicating ancient migration flows from Southwest Asia. The study found no substantial genetic contribution from Central or Southern African hunter-gatherer populations, though researchers cautioned against broad conclusions due to the limited sample size. Archaeological and genetic evidence confirms deep interactions between Egyptians and Nubians dating back over 5,000 years. These relationships range from trade and cultural exchange to military conflict. Genetic studies of ancient Nubians reveal significant Levantine-related ancestry, consistent with shared Neolithic movements. Modern Egyptians and Nubians also show later admixture events linked to Roman rule, trans-Saharan trade, and Islamic expansion. The paternal haplogroup E1b1b is widespread across Egypt and much of Africa, with origins traced to East Africa. Studies of Upper Egyptian populations have identified genetic markers common across the continent, though scholars caution that results remain preliminary. Some DNA analyses of royal mummies suggest affinities with sub-Saharan populations, but methodological limitations prevent definitive conclusions. Many scholars argue that ancient Egypt emerged primarily from Northeast African populations, with additional influences from neighboring regions over time. As research continues, Egypt's population history is increasingly understood as complex, dynamic, and deeply African, shaped by migration, climate change, and long-term cultural interaction rather than a single origin. For decades, debates about the race and ethnicity of ancient Egyptians have been shaped by modern assumptions rather than ancient realities. Today, mainstream scholarship presents a far more nuanced and evidence-based understanding of who the ancient Egyptians were. Most scholars agree that pre-dynastic Egypt emerged from Northeast Africa, drawing its foundational populations from regions that included the Nile Valley, Nubia, the Sahara, and tropical Africa. As Egypt developed into a powerful civilization, its population became increasingly diverse, reflecting its position as a crossroads between Africa and Eurasia. Biological and archaeological evidence shows a clear regional variation within Egypt itself. Upper Egyptians, in the south, shared stronger biological affinities with Nubian and other African populations to the south. Lower Egyptians, in the north, showed closer genetic and cultural links with the Levant and the Mediterranean world. This was not unusual. It was the natural result of trade, migration, and interaction over thousands of years. As historians William Stiebling and Susan Helft note, some ancient Egyptians may have resembled people of the Middle East, others resembled Sudanese or Ethiopian populations, and many reflected the diversity found across Africa. The key point is this: ancient Egypt was never a single racial type. It was a heterogeneous civilization, shaped by Africa first, but open to the wider world. Recent studies emphasize that Egyptian identity was primarily cultural and social, not racial in the modern sense. Being Egyptian meant sharing language, religious beliefs, customs, and loyalty to the state, not belonging to a rigid biological category. Scholars like Riggs and Baines argue that the sharp division often made between Egyptians and foreigners oversimplifies reality. Archaeological evidence shows that Nubians, Libyans, and West Asian peoples lived in Egypt, worked in its economy, served in its armies, and sometimes rose to positions of power. Intermarriage, shared food traditions, and blended artistic styles reveal that ethnic boundaries were flexible and constantly shifting. Although state art sometimes portrayed outsiders using stereotypes, often for political or symbolic reasons, everyday life tells a more complex story. Ancient Egypt was deeply interconnected with neighboring regions, especially Africa. Several scholars have also highlighted Egypt's strong cultural and spiritual ties to the land of Punt, which the Egyptians called 𝒂𝒣𝒐𝒕𝒆, meaning God's land. Temple reliefs depict the people of Punt with features and skin tones similar to Egyptians, reinforcing the idea of shared African connections rather than distant foreignness. The influence of ancient Egypt did not end with the fall of the pharaohs. Its legacy spread across Africa, the Mediterranean, and beyond. Egypt profoundly shaped the civilizations of Kush and Meroe, located in present-day Sudan. These kingdoms adopted Egyptian religious beliefs, burial practices, monumental architecture, and writing systems. Hundreds of pyramids, many built after Egypt's own pyramid age, stand as testimony to this cultural exchange. The Meroitic script, derived from Egyptian writing, became one of Africa's earliest written languages after hieroglyphs. Egyptian religious traditions also traveled far beyond the Nile Valley. The worship of Isis, for example, became widespread throughout the Roman Empire, and Egyptian obelisks were transported to Rome, where many still stand today. Classical writers such as Herodotus, Strabo, and Diodorus Siculus studied Egypt and portrayed it as a land of ancient wisdom and mystery. Even as pagan traditions declined with the rise of Christianity and Islam, interest in Egypt never fully disappeared. During the Middle Ages, scholars like Dhul-Nun al-Misri and al-Makrizi preserved Egyptian knowledge through historical writings. Later, European travelers fueled a wave of Egyptomania, influencing architecture, symbols, and even political imagery in the modern world. In the modern era, Egyptology emerged as a formal discipline, though often shaped by colonial power dynamics. Today, Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities oversees excavations and artifact recovery, emphasizing preservation and cultural respect. One powerful symbol of continuity is the Abu Hagag Mosque, built into the Luxor Temple complex. This site has been in continuous use for over 3,000 years, making it one of the longest-used sacred spaces on Earth. Before we continue, support Africarized by visiting the Africarized shop, where you'll find African-inspired apparel, books, home decor, and accessories that celebrate African history and identity. If you're enjoying this documentary, please like, share, and comment. It really helps the channel grow. Subscribe to Africarized on YouTube and follow us on Facebook for more powerful African history and truth-telling. And let us know in the comments, What documentary do you want to watch next on Africa?